The text bubbles appeared, then disappeared. 3 dots pulsating like a heartbeat, promising a response that never came. You stare at your phone, checking for the 20th time today. Nothing. The person who seemed so interested, who mirrored your excitement, who talked about future plans just yesterday, has vanished without explanation. Ghosted. The particular sting of this modern rejection method leaves a wound unlike any other. It's not just the pain of being rejected, it's the maddening absence of closure. Your mind fills this void with questions, self-doubt, and scenarios that spin endlessly, seeking some explanation for the sudden disappearance of someone who seemed so perfectly aligned with you. What if that perfect alignment, that sense of finally finding your person, wasn't what you thought it was? What if the very intensity that made the connection feel fated was actually rooted in something far more complicated? The revolutionary insights of psychoanalysis offer a surprising framework for understanding these painful romantic patterns. Though never swiping through dating profiles or being left on read, these psychological pioneers identified unconscious mechanisms that illuminate even our most modern relationship struggles. Our unconscious mind influences far more of our romantic choices than we realize. That immediate chemistry, that sense of familiarity with someone you've just met, that feeling of finally finding the one. These powerful experiences may not be indicators of cosmic compatibility, but signals from your unconscious recognizing familiar patterns. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't just explain why someone disappeared. It can free you from repeating patterns that keep you trapped in cycles of connection and abandonment. When someone suddenly vanishes, we naturally turn inward, examining everything we might have done wrong. Sometimes, specific dynamics do trigger unconscious responses that create distance. The most powerful of these connections often form not because they represent healing, but because they reactivate the most familiar emotional landscapes of our earliest experiences. I've never felt this way before. It's like you understand parts of me no one else has ever seen. That overwhelming sense of recognition, of finally being truly seen, creates one of the most powerful bonds in adult relationships. But this experience often signals something more complex than destiny. The unconscious mind constantly seeks to resolve unfinished emotional business from childhood. When someone seems to perfectly understand your deepest self, they may actually be mirroring your earliest attachment patterns, for better or worse. This psychological mechanism operates beneath conscious awareness. The date who feels instantly familiar, who seems to know exactly how to respond to your emotional needs, may be unconsciously replicating patterns from your earliest relationships. Your unconscious recognizes this familiarity and reads it as destiny rather than repetition. Consider the common scenario. After several disappointing relationships, you meet someone who immediately feels different. Conversation flows effortlessly. They anticipate your thoughts, validate your feelings in ways no one else has. This powerful connection creates the sensation of having found your other half. What's often really happening is a sophisticated form of pattern recognition, your unconscious identifying emotional dynamics that match your earliest experiences of love. The unconscious doesn't distinguish between healthy familiarity and toxic familiarity. It simply recognizes patterns. If your childhood featured inconsistent attention, moments of intense connection followed by emotional abandonment, you may be unconsciously drawn to partners who recreate this dynamic. The exhilarating highs feel like destiny. The devastating lows feel inexplicable. This pattern creates particular confusion when the connection feels uniquely positive. Your conscious mind registers the intense understanding and validation as evidence of exceptional compatibility. Your unconscious recognizes the familiar emotional landscape, including the potential for familiar pain. This disconnect between conscious interpretation and unconscious recognition creates the perfect conditions for seemingly inexplicable ghosting. I think we need to talk about what happened last weekend. Something felt off between us. Direct confrontation of relationship discomfort activates one of the most fundamental psychological drives, the impulse to seek pleasure and avoid pain. When faced with potentially uncomfortable conversations, many people choose avoidance over engagement, not from malice, but from basic psychological self-protection. This avoidance mechanism operates almost automatically. The person who seemed fully invested suddenly disappears when the relationship requires navigating emotional complexity. Their unconscious calculates the discomfort of difficult communication against the relief of simple avoidance. Without strong countervailing forces, avoidance often wins. Dating landscapes are filled with this dynamic. The relationship progresses smoothly until a conflict arises, a boundary needs discussion, or emotional intimacy deepens beyond comfortable limits. One person attempts to address the issue directly. The other becomes increasingly distant, eventually disappearing completely rather than engaging with discomfort. This avoidance isn't necessarily conscious calculation. The person doesn't explicitly think, "This conversation would be uncomfortable, so I'll ghost instead." Rather, they experience growing unease, a vague sense of pressure, and find themselves too busy to respond or conveniently forgetting to reply. The conscious mind provides rational justifications for what the unconscious has already decided. Avoid the discomfort at all costs. What makes this pattern particularly confusing is its selective application. The same person who ghosts rather than discussing relationship concerns might be perfectly capable of difficult conversations in other contexts. The pleasure principle operates most powerfully around attachment and intimacy, where emotional stakes feel highest and unconscious patterns run deepest. My parents never really listened when I tried to explain my feelings. They'd always turn it around to be about them. The psychological mechanism of transference, projecting feelings, expectations, and patterns from past relationships onto current ones, creates some of the most confusing dynamics in romantic connections. When someone reminds us unconsciously of important figures from our past, we respond not just to who they are, but to all the emotional associations they trigger. This transference operates without conscious awareness. The date who displays a specific mannerism, communication style, or emotional response that resembles a parent or former partner activates entire relationship templates from the past. Your responses become shaped not just by the current interaction, but by the accumulated emotional history attached to similar patterns. Dating experiences frequently feature this dynamic. A potentially promising connection suddenly changes when one person displays a trait that unconsciously reminds the other of someone who caused pain in the past. The reaction seems disproportionate to the current situation because it's responding to accumulated emotional history, not just the present moment. A common example: someone whose parent constantly criticized their achievements meets a date who makes an innocent comment about their career. Though objectively mild, this comment activates the entire emotional pattern associated with criticism. The unconscious doesn't distinguish between past and present sources of similar feelings. The reaction is to the entire pattern, not just the current trigger. What makes transference particularly powerful in romantic relationships is its invisibility to both parties. The person reacting strongly to seemingly minor triggers doesn't connect their response to past patterns. The person witnessing what appears to be an overreaction doesn't understand the historical context making it make sense. This mutual incomprehension often leads to withdrawal rather than understanding. "I think I'm falling in love with you. I've never felt so comfortable being completely myself with someone." Declarations of deepening emotional intimacy often trigger one of the most powerful unconscious defense mechanisms: fear of vulnerability. While consciously seeking connection, the unconscious mind often fears the very intimacy it desires, creating protective distance precisely when the relationship deepens. This self-protective mechanism operates beneath awareness. The person who seemed eager for commitment suddenly becomes unavailable when real emotional intimacy emerges. Their unconscious calculates the vulnerability required for deep connection against the potential pain of eventual rejection or abandonment. Without conscious intervention, self-protection often prevails. Dating patterns frequently demonstrate this dynamic. The relationship progresses smoothly through initial stages of getting acquainted. Shared activities, surface-level disclosures, and physical chemistry create connection without threatening the ego's protective boundaries. When emotional intimacy deepens, when real vulnerability enters the equation, unconscious alarm bell. A typical scenario: after several promising months, one person shares a significant emotional disclosure or expresses deeper feelings. Rather than drawing closer, their partner becomes increasingly distant, finding reasons to reduce contact until communication eventually stops entirely. The timing isn't coincidental. The withdrawal directly follows increased intimacy. This pattern creates particular confusion because it contradicts conscious desires. The person who withdraws often genuinely wants connection, but finds themselves overwhelmed by unconscious fears when that connection materializes. Their disappearance isn't calculated deception, but unconscious self-protection, a pattern they themselves may not understand. All my relationships end the same way. I don't know why I keep choosing people who can't commit. Perhaps the most perplexing psychological mechanism in relationships is unconscious self-sabotage, the tendency to create exactly the painful outcomes we consciously fear most. This pattern stems from a paradoxical aspect of human psychology. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar healing. This self-defeating mechanism operates beneath conscious intention. The person who repeatedly creates relationship scenarios that end in abandonment isn't consciously choosing pain. Rather, their unconscious is seeking the emotional landscape it knows how to navigate, even when that landscape causes suffering. Dating experiences often reveal these self-sabotaging patterns. Someone with a history of abandonment unconsciously tests new partners through behaviors that trigger rejection, excessive demands, unreasonable jealousy, or creating conflicts that force the other person to demonstrate commitment or leave. These tests aren't conscious strategies, but unconscious recreations of familiar emotional scenarios. Consider the common pattern. A relationship develops positively, showing real potential for healthy attachment. As commitment deepens, one person begins creating conflict, finding fault, or becoming increasingly critical. These behaviors don't reflect their true assessment of the relationship, but their unconscious fear of unfamiliar emotional territory. If all previous relationships ended in abandonment, the unconscious may orchestrate familiar pain rather than risk unfamiliar vulnerability. What makes this pattern particularly destructive is its self-confirming nature. Each relationship that ends through these unconscious sabotage mechanisms reinforces the belief that relationships inevitably lead to pain. This belief then justifies further protective measures in future connections, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of approach and avoidance. The deeper understanding of these psychological mechanisms offers something more valuable than dating tactics. It provides liberation from self-blame when relationships suddenly end. Ghosting often triggers intense self-criticism, a painful excavation of personal flaws that might explain the unexplained disappearance. The psychological reality is far more complex. When someone withdraws without explanation, they're often responding to unconscious triggers rather than conscious evaluations of worth. Understanding this doesn't guarantee connection, but it preserves self-worth amid rejection. This perspective shifts the narrative from personal inadequacy to psychological patterns. The question transforms from "what's wrong with me?" to "what unconscious mechanisms might be operating here?" This reframing doesn't eliminate disappointment, but reduces its destructive power over self-perception. Recognition of these patterns creates the possibility of intervention. When you notice yourself intensely drawn to someone who feels strangely familiar, you might pause to examine what specific qualities trigger that recognition. When a partner withdraws after intimacy deepens, understanding the fear of vulnerability offers context that depersonalizes their reaction. When relationships repeatedly follow similar painful patterns, recognizing unconscious self-sabotage creates space for different choices. The most valuable insight might be recognizing that ghosting often reveals more about the ghoster's psychological limitations than the ghosted person's worth. Someone unable to communicate discomfort, navigate emotional complexity, or provide basic closure demonstrates constrained psychological resources, constraints that would eventually limit intimacy regardless of how the relationship began. This understanding doesn't justify hurtful behavior, but contextualizes it within human psychological functioning. The person who disappears without explanation isn't necessarily malicious. They're often unconsciously avoiding discomfort. They lack the psychological tools to navigate productively. The freedom in this perspective comes from recognizing that romantic disconnection, particularly when it occurs through avoidance rather than communication, rarely reflects accurate assessment of worth. It more often reveals the limitations of someone's psychological resources, limitations that would eventually constrain the relationship regardless of its initial promise. This insight doesn't eliminate the pain of rejection, but transforms its meaning. the disappearance becomes less a judgment of personal value and more a revelation of psychological compatibility. This perspective preserves self-worth amid disappointment, allowing forward movement without the burden of unwarranted self-criticism. The ultimate wisdom in understanding these psychological mechanisms isn't in manipulating them for better outcomes, but in recognizing their operation in ourselves and others. This awareness creates space for compassion, both for those who withdraw when unconsciously triggered and for ourselves when facing the pain of unexplained rejection. So, is he your soulmate or just a childhood trauma trigger? The honest answer acknowledges the complex interplay between these possibilities. The intense familiarity that feels like destiny might indeed reflect exceptional compatibility. It might also signal the recognition of patterns established in your earliest relationships, patterns that offer both the comfort of familiarity and the potential for repeating old wounds. The greatest freedom might be recognizing that both interpretations contain truth. Powerful attraction often combines genuine compatibility with unconscious pattern recognition. The question isn't which explanation is correct, but which aspects of the connection support health and growth versus which recreate limiting patterns from the past. Understanding these psychological dynamics doesn't diminish the magic of connection, but contextualizes it within human psychological functioning. That person who feels like they've always been waiting for you might indeed represent unique compatibility. They might also feel familiar because they activate deeply established emotional patterns from your past. This nuanced understanding provides something more valuable than binary categorizations of connections as either destined or trauma-based. It offers a framework for engaging with the complexity of attraction, for distinguishing between the aspects of powerful connection that support growth and those that unconsciously recreate limitation. The next time someone disappears without explanation or a promising connection suddenly shifts, consider the unconscious mechanisms that might be operating beneath the surface. This perspective doesn't eliminate disappointment, but transforms it from evidence of personal failing to information about psychological compatibility. This understanding offers something more valuable than tactics for preventing rejection. It provides resilience when rejection occurs. The freedom in this perspective comes from recognizing that someone's withdrawal often reveals more about their psychological limitations than your inherent worth. This insight preserves self-esteem amid disappointment, allowing forward movement without the weight of unwarranted self-criticism. In a dating landscape where powerful initial connection often gives way to unexplained disappearance, understanding these psychological mechanisms provides a crucial shield against the erosion of self-worth. The person who ghosts after intense connection demonstrates limited psychological resources, limitations that would eventually constrain intimacy, regardless of how promising the beginning seemed. This perspective transforms ghosting from personal rejection to psychological information, valuable data about compatibility rather than damning evidence of inadequacy. This reframing doesn't eliminate disappointment, but reduces its power to diminish self-perception. The question becomes not, why wasn't I enough? But what does this reveal about our psychological patterns and what I truly need in connection? The greatest wisdom might be recognizing that the very intensity that makes some connections feel destined also makes them vulnerable to unconscious defensive reactions. When powerful attraction activates deep psychological patterns, it inevitably triggers both the potential for healing and the impulse towards self-protection. Understanding this complexity doesn't guarantee perfect connection, but it does protect against the self-diminishment that often follows romantic disappointment. What first appears as the cosmic alignment of soulmates may indeed contain elements of genuine compatibility. It may also reflect the recognition of familiar emotional patterns, some supporting growth, others recreating limitation. The freedom lies not in determining which explanation is correct, but in engaging consciously with the complexity of connection, allowing space for both the magic of compatibility and the reality of psychological patterns that shape our experience of love.